Good evening. I'm Jim Edmondson. I'm the Chief Curator of the District Medical History Center, and I'm so pleased you could come out tonight on a holiday and hope you have some reverie later on. But tonight we are here for the Percy Sky Lecture, and Percy's the nice gentleman in a cap down in front here. He is the individual who brought the contraceptive collection to Cleveland, and we're very pleased about that. Had previously been in Toronto at the ortho factory there. And then over time, he keeps engaged with us, and one of the big pluses of that relationship is he endowed a lecture. So each year we were able to bring a scholar to campus to talk on some aspect of contraception. And this year, very pleased to have Professor, or actually should say Dean and Vice Chancellor Elizabeth Watkins, a very well-established scholar in the history of contraception. We were comparing notes. We've known each other for about 20 years. Liz came here and saw the museum years ago. She was here most recently probably in 2009 when we hosted the American Association for the History of Medicine. At that time, we had not yet completed our gallery, but it was finished a few months after that, and she was really enjoyed seeing it today in its full glory. I have a couple notes on her many publications on the topic of the history of contraception. Liz went to Harvard for a BA in biology and then completed a PhD in history. Was that history of science or just history? A very fine program at Harvard University. She is the author of On the Pill, A Social History of Oral Contraceptives, which analyzes the development and subsequent impact of oral contraception on American society and culture in the 1950s and 60s. So in many ways, your talk tonight is kind of an update of that, bringing it forward. She also wrote The Estrogen Elixir, A History of Hormone Replacement Therapy in America, which is the story of the rise and fall and the rise again and fall again of estrogen and its promise to forestall the disease of aging in women. And for tonight's talk, she'll be presenting Reconceiving the Pill, from Revolutionary Therapeutics to Lifestyle Drug. And in this talk, she will explore how marketing decisions, rather than scientific innovation, have guided the development and positioning of contraceptive products in recent years. And at the conclusion, we'll have opportunity for some question and answer, and then hopefully you'll be able to join us up in the museum for refreshments and a reception up there. You can chat more. So with that, I'll let Liz take the stage.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks to all of you for coming out here. I want to especially thank Percy Sky for endowing this lecture and allowing me to come, but also for his wonderful collection. As Jim said, I had actually seen a portion of the collection back in the late 90s when I had the opportunity to be in Toronto, where Percy and the collection was originally housed. And I knew in the 2000s that it was coming to the District, and we kept waiting for it to come, and I've looked at it online, so it was a real pleasure to be able to see it here in 3 dimensions in the museum. And for those of you who haven't been through the collection, I strongly encourage you to take a look. It's really wonderful. There's some wonderful interpretation, but the artifacts are just really, really nice to see in all their complexity. It's delightful to give this lecture here at the District Museum. Jim said we would go back 20 years. I worked as a museum curator after I finished my PhD for several years, and that was one of the reasons I came to Cleveland for the first time, to see what Jim was doing. He's been at the forefront in museum exhibit design, and so a colleague and I had come to meet him. And so it's really nice to be able to give this talk in this context. And I see a lot of young faces in the audience, and so you may be wondering, Jim said that I wrote a book on the pill, and so you may be wondering, well, why is she still talking about that? So I want to talk a little bit before I start just about how I have continued to maintain this scholarly relationship, if you will, with the pill. It was my doctoral dissertation at Harvard, and it became a book, and I thought I would move on from that would be the end of my relationship with studying the pill. But in the past 5 years, I've had 2 occasions to re-engage with it on a scholarly basis. The first was that in 2011, I was invited to participate in the 50th symposium marking the 50th anniversary of the pill in Canada. It was approved 1 year later than it was in the United States. And I started thinking, and I hadn't really thought about the pill for 15 years. And And the work I had done originally had pretty much stopped around 1970. I looked at the first decade of the pill, and I was really interested into how it moved into society and how it was received by society. I was really interested in what its relationship was with the feminist movement, but I sort of hadn't followed the story along. And in the course of getting ready for this lecture, for the lecture in Canada, I realized that there was a lot more to be told about the pill, and that its trajectory had really taken on a number of different paths from the 70s up until into the 21st century. And so I worked on that, and I thought, well, that was interesting, and then I thought to put it aside. And then most recently, I was invited to co-edit a book on therapeutic revolutions. And by therapeutic revolutions, we were talking about the mid-century explosion of drugs and pharmaceuticals that came onto the market and that really gave physicians tools that they hadn't had before. And well, a group of historians and anthropologists, were interested in looking at how people at the time understood these drugs, both the physicians and the larger community of people who took them, how they understood them as these drugs as being revolutionary, and as importantly, how that notion of revolution has played on in history as well, in terms of understanding that period of time. And so this gave me the opportunity to revisit the pill with a whole separate lens in terms of thinking about it as part of a revolution or not, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And so I think what's been interesting for me is the notion that history is living, is that there's no sort of one final story to be told in history, but we learn more not only from the other scholarship we do and from the changing times. We ask different questions about it, and so this gives us a novel opportunity to re-engage with the subject. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. And I just wanted to give you that as a preface. So the context today will really be thinking about the pill in terms of, oops, I started moving this ahead, didn't I? There we go. Thinking about it in terms of this larger notion of therapeutic revolution. So I'll be looking at sort of the longue durée of the history of the pill from when it was first developed in the 50s up until the present. So, when asked to compare the practice of medicine today to that of 100 years ago, most people will respond with a story of therapeutic revolution. Back then, we had few effective remedies. Now we have more and more powerful tools to fight disease. These narratives are often illustrated with specific pharmaceuticals, such as antibiotics that defeated infectious disease, vaccines that prevented childhood disease, cardiovascular diseases that help stem the epidemic of heart disease, immunosuppressants that make complex organ transplants possible, psychotropic drugs that controlled the demons of psychosis and that lifted the veil of depression. And these stories have become familiar catechisms of the biomedical present. They suggest sudden and dramatic forms of social change that followed in the wake of a series of magic bullets discovered over the course of the 20th century. In these versions of history, medicine was made modern and effectual by medicines. When Margaret Sanger conjured up the vision of a birth control pill in 1946, she tapped into the budding zeitgeist of this mid-20th century therapeutic revolution that was based on the promise and potential of a new generation of so-called wonder drugs. By the time the first oral contraceptive was developed and approved for sale in the United States in 1960, dozens of pharmaceuticals had come onto the market for the treatment of a wide variety of conditions. Available by prescription only, these drugs were powerful weapons in the physician's arsenal. The ability to cure or prevent disease, or at least to allay its symptoms, greatly increased the authority and prestige of physicians and led to what has nostalgically been called the golden age of American medicine. In this context, the birth control pill contributed to the growing narratives of therapeutic revolution by extending the reach of pharmacy beyond the treatment or prevention of disease or illness. Oral contraceptives prevent pregnancy, not normally considered to be a state of disease or illness. Unlike the other methods available in 1960, the pill offered near-perfect effectiveness and the advantage of separating contraception in both time and place from the act of sexual intercourse. Over the course of a decade, this pharmaceutical innovation effected a contraceptive revolution in the United States and in many other countries by changing the way people thought about, discussed, and used birth control. Although much ink was spilled during the 1960s, either crediting or blaming the pill for fomenting sexual revolution, it's clear from the historical record that the pill played only a supporting role as one of many factors contributing to the liberalization and democratization of sexual behavior and attitudes. It played a similarly auxiliary part in the revolutionary appeal of second-wave feminist activism that swept the U.S. in the late 1960s and 1970s. The ability to plan whether and when to have children enabled women to pursue a wider range of education and employment opportunities. The pill, in concert with a whole host of other social, cultural, and political forces, helped to make women's lives in the 1980s look very different from those of their mothers in the 1950s. And by the 1990s, the pill had become part of the birth control establishment, prescribed and used more often than any method of birth control, of reversible birth control. Well after its revolutionary heyday, it still served as the standard to which newer methods were compared. Manufacturers of oral contraceptives shifted the focus of their marketing strategies away from the primary indication of family planning to emphasize instead the secondary effects of relieving discomforts resulting from the menstrual cycle, such as pimples, irritability, and monthly bleeding. So tonight what I want to do is I want to explore this shift in the conceptualization of the pill from life-changing to life-enhancing, from revolutionary to commonplace, and the implications for the trajectories of women, birth control, and pharmaceutical consumerism. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the development of the birth control pill in the 1950s and pick up the story in the next decade. It's hard to overstate the rapid and pervasive influence of the birth control pill on women's contraceptive practices and on the contraceptive marketplace in the 1960s and 70s. There we go. In 1955, more than half of the American women who used birth control relied on either condoms, which were at 27%, or the diaphragm, 25%. 10 years later, those figures had changed dramatically. In 1965, 5 years after the pill was approved, 27% of American women reported use of the pill, 18% used condoms, and just 10% relied on a diaphragm. Now, several factors contributed to this exponential rise in pill use during its first 5 years on the market. Physicians enthusiastically prescribed the pill because it was easy to do so, because it increased their jurisdiction in the realm of family planning, and because it provided them with a financial incentive, since patients were required to visit doctors' offices to obtain renewals. Planned Parenthood encouraged its affiliates to provide the pill to clients, reaching many women who might not otherwise have had access to private physicians. And women encountered ample publicity about the pill in newspapers and popular magazines, prompting them to request oral contraceptives from doctors and clinics and private practices. In 1970, some 9 million American women took the pill each day, with another 10 million worldwide. By 1973, oral contraceptives were used by 36% of white married women. Only 13.5% were using condoms, and a mere 3.4% used a diaphragm. Clearly, a revolution in contraception took place between 1960 and 1975 in the United States. If we define that revolution in terms of the methods most commonly used by white married women, and I keep saying white married women because these are the only data available because studies at the time only included white married women. Now, it's important to point out that this change was in the kind of method used. Most married women were already using some form of birth control, 70% in 1955 and 81% by 1960. Similarly, attitudes toward contraception had evolved into acceptance decades earlier for most Americans. Only Roman Catholics expressed ambivalence about the use of birth control, but their attitudes changed rapidly in the era of the pill. A Gallup poll taken in 1962 revealed that 56% of Catholics agreed that birth control information should be available to anyone who wanted it. When pollsters asked the same question 2 years later, 78% of Catholics concurred. And by the mid-1970s, any disparity in attitudes toward or use of the pill between Protestants and Catholics had completely disappeared. For Catholic Americans, the pill brought about a transformation in their obeisance to the central Roman Catholic tenet on procreation. Although physicians were the only ones authorized to write prescriptions for oral contraceptives, they did not wield complete control over the use of the pill. And indeed, the pill altered the relationships between doctors and patients in unanticipated ways. Traditionally, when a person felt ill and went to the doctor's office, he or she relied on the doctor to diagnose the condition and to determine the course of therapy. Oral contraception changed that script. Women knew exactly what the problem was, they wanted to prevent pregnancy, and how to treat it by taking the pill. All they needed from the physician was a written prescription to take to the pharmacy to obtain the pills. Women who went to their physicians with specific requests for oral contraceptives no longer passively received medical care, but transformed into active participants. If a doctor refused to comply, the patient could, and frequently would, find another, more willing provider. In the early 1960s, women who requested oral contraceptives from their physicians helped to shift the balance of power in the traditional doctor-patient relationship. Later in the decade, when research studies called the safety of the pill into question, women felt confident enough to doubt their physician's judgment and to demand full disclosure so that they could make their own informed decisions about whether or not to take it. The popularity of the pill in the 1960s owed much to its efficiency and its discreetness. Its 98 to 99% rate of effectiveness was far greater than that obtainable with any other method available at mid-century. This highly reliable contraceptive gave women, for the first time in history, the ability to choose whether and when to have children. It also provided, for the first time, a way to separate the act of contraception from the act of sexual intercourse, allowing women secure and total control over their own fertility without the knowledge, participation, or approval of their sexual partners. So, do the changes brought about by the birth control pill add up to a therapeutic revolution? Well, revolution is variously defined as an instance of revolving, a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system, or a dramatic and wide-reaching change in the way something works or is organized or in people's ideas about it, which is the apposite definition for this discussion. Therapeutic can mean of or relating to the healing of disease, administered or applied for reasons of health, or having a good effect on the mind or body and contributing to a sense of well-being. While the first definition does not apply, as pregnancy is not a disease to be healed, the other two are consistent with the reasons for which women chose and continue to choose to use contraception. The application or administration of birth control to prevent pregnancy, or, looked at from a different angle, to maintain a non-pregnant state of health, certainly contributes to a woman's sense of well-being. And while many normative debates have asked whether the net effect of contraception is good or not, it clearly has the desired effect on the body, namely the maintenance of the non-pregnant state. Did the advent of the pill lead to a dramatic and wide-ranging change in the way birth control works and in people's ideas about birth control? Absolutely. Moreover, the pill extended the reach of medico-pharmaceutical intervention beyond the treatment or prevention of disease, expanding the scope of medical practice to incorporate birth control. Now, contemporaries clearly recognized the revolutionary potential of the pill. In 1968, the popular anthropologist Ashley Montagu pronounced its invention to be as important as the discovery of fire and the development of tool-making, hunting, agriculture, urbanism, scientific medicine, and nuclear energy. Individual women understood the revolutionary nature of the pill at a very personal level. Said one satisfied user to her doctor in the late 1960s, and I'm quoting, "For the first time in 18 years of married life, I can put my feet up for an hour and read a magazine. If you refuse to give me the pill, I'll go get it from someone else," unquote. Journalists also promoted the dual promise of oral contraception as the newest pharmaceutical technology to come out of the scientific laboratory. They touted its convenience for individuals and its potential for population control. And population control was depicted positively. Journalists at the time made no mention of the possibility of coercion or eugenics. The presentation of individual convenience, however, was tempered by the possibility of negative medical side effects, and newspapers and magazines devoted considerable space to these problems. However, much of the popular media coverage of the pill was infused with a faith in science to continue to make improvements in its formulation. And articles in mass market magazines demonstrated this modernist optimism. A piece in Reader's Digest proclaimed, quote, "Almost surely, better pills with fewer side effects are on the way." Gregory Pincus, who was one of the founders of the birth control pill, wrote in Ladies' Home Journal, in an article in Ladies' Home Journal, he had a monthly Tell Me Doctor column, quote, "With the application of the method of science to the problem of human fertility, the development of adequate methods is inevitable," unquote. In addition, popular articles on oral contraception stressed the importance of the role of the physician. The pill could be obtained only by prescription. Good Housekeeping's readers were told that its use was, quote, "a medical judgment to be made by physicians," unquote. And so these articles implied that while the drugs might produce side effects, scientists were working to correct these flaws, and physicians had the wisdom to prescribe oral contraceptives prudently. In the early 1960s, newspapers and popular periodicals depicted the pill in particular, and science in general, as holding tremendous promise and potential, and women leapt to avail themselves of this latest innovation of medical science. As the decade progressed, journalists debated the broader social impact of the pill, especially as it might influence morality, marriage, and family life. As these writers conveyed the impression of social upheaval to their readers, they pointed to the pill as an influential factor. The role played by the pill in contributing to women's sexual liberation or promiscuity depended on the editorial stance of the article. Either way, the popular press implicated oral contraceptives to some extent in America's sexual revolution. Ultimately, few took seriously the conservative warnings that the pill would lead young women down a dangerous descent into promiscuity. It's not known how many single women were using oral contraceptives in the 1960s, because the first demographic study of contraceptive practices among unmarried women wasn't conducted until 1971. But to the growing number of young women attending college and joining the workforce and living on their own and delaying marriage and motherhood, the pill was perceived as a revolutionary option at their disposal. And by the late 1960s, the pill had become the icon of the sexual revolution. This one particularly striking pictorial representation, and I saw that it was upstairs in the exhibit as well, is this photo from the cover of Time magazine in 1967 of dozens of birth control pills fashioned into the shape of the scientific symbol for female. At the same time, the thinking of 1960s era population control advocates was characterized by the assumption that a technological solution to preventing pregnancy, as opposed to more sweeping educational and social reforms, could stimulate economic development abroad and reduce poverty at home. Although this overly simplistic model faded during the 1970s, birth control in general and the oral contraceptive as a specific method earned acknowledgement as a basic health need for women of reproductive age, whether provided by physicians or obtained via other channels. In 1977, the World Health Organization made this recognition explicit by including the combination progestin and estrogen oral contraceptive pill on its first list of essential medicines. According to the WHO, the pill was an essential medicine, defined as one that met, quote, "the priority healthcare needs of the population because of its public health relevance, evidence on efficacy and safety, and comparative cost effectiveness," unquote. The reputation of the pill as being revolutionary in birth control was magnified by its ancillary role as something revolutionary in society. As I mentioned earlier, oral contraceptives transformed the personal lives of a significant proportion of Roman Catholic women by giving them a means to control their fertility. And for these women, taking a daily pill seemed more palatable and less sacrilegious than using a barrier contraceptive at the time of intercourse. As more and more women ignored the papal proscription of artificial birth control, they contributed to the growing distance between the Catholic laity and hierarchy in the United States. Furthermore, the pill played a part in the evolution of women's liberation regardless of their religion. By providing women with the easy-to-use and highly effective means to delay and space childbearing, or to avoid it entirely, the pill opened up new possibilities for them to work, study, and participate more fully in public life. At the same time, the pill was only one of several interacting developments and trends that produced a shift in American culture, from restraint to openness in sex and sexuality. As I discuss in my book on the history of oral contraceptives, the pill did not single-handedly bring about a sexual revolution in the 1960s, but it did contribute to changing sexual mores, attitudes, and practices. When it came to sex, Americans in the 1970s thought, spoke, and behaved in ways that differed greatly from those just 2 decades earlier. So the revolutionary impact and impression of the birth control pill was complicated in the late 1960s by research evidence that associated oral contraceptive use with increased risk of potentially fatal blood clots. These findings led to highly publicized Senate hearings about the safety of the pill in 1970 and eventually resulted in a patient package insert that was the first of its kind to warn consumers of the adverse health effects of this prescription drug. Concerns about the safety of the pill came to a head with the publication of journalist Barbara Seaman's book, The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, in 1969, and Senator Gaylord Nelson's hearings on oral contraceptives as part of his committee's investigation of the drug industry in 1970. Seaman and Nelson represented a growing ambivalence towards science and medicine in American society. On the one hand, they questioned the merit and safety of the pill, a product of medical science and technology, and they criticized scientists and physicians for their incursion into family planning. On the other hand, they based their critiques on evidence from scientists and physicians, and they found themselves on opposing sides of the debate over the pill because of the way the Senate hearings were handled. Barbara Seaman was not invited to testify, nor were any users of the pill allowed to provide their perspective. To protest these omissions, women from the group DC Women's Liberation organized demonstrations at the Senate hearings. A group of 20 women arrived early each day and strategically placed themselves at the end and in the middle of every other row of seats. They came prepared with questions to interrupt the hearings and with bail money tucked inside their boots. Ironically, both the feminists and Senator Nelson agreed on most issues concerning the pill. They believed that the Food and Drug Administration had allowed the drug companies to market the pill without adequate testing of its long-term safety. To illustrate the problem of insufficient testing, both likened the millions of women who used the pill to unsuspecting guinea pigs in a massive experiment. In spite of the medical controversy over the safety of the pill, neither the feminists nor Senator Nelson advocated a ban on the oral contraceptives. Both realized that such a proposal was unrealistic and impractical and could lead to a black market for the pills that would be even more dangerous for women. Instead, both Senator Nelson and the DC Women's Liberation Group argued that women needed access to all available information on the pill so that they could make intelligent decisions about birth control. They agreed that the lack of informed consent stemmed from the problem of poor communication between doctors and patients. At this point, the opinions of the senator and the feminist diverged. For Nelson, the issue of informed consent could be solved by improving the channels of communication among the manufacturers, the FDA, physicians, and patients. The more radical feminists saw the pill as the tip of the iceberg of a much larger problem in women's health care, and they doubted that these problems could be solved within the context of the contemporary system of male-dominated medicine. Now, the outcome of the Senate hearings in 1970 satisfied none of the interested parties. The FDA mandated a patient package insert for oral contraceptives to warn patients about the serious side effect of abnormal blood clotting. Consumers and feminists objected to the brevity of the insert. The 100-word label described the availability of an information booklet which the patient could request from her physician. The longer pamphlet was written by the American Medical Association in conjunction with the FDA and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, but the onus fell on the patient to ask her physician for the booklet. Physicians and manufacturers objected to any patient package labeling. They wanted control of all medical information to remain in the hands of medical professions to be dispensed as the physicians saw fit. The percentage of contraceptive users taking the pill dropped during the 1970s as concerned women switched to non-hormonal methods or chose permanent sterilization. The rate of use among married women fell from 36% in 1973 to just 20% in 1982. And during the same period, the rate of sterilization by tubal ligation among married women more than doubled, and more married men underwent vasectomies, so that by 1988, almost half of married couples relied on either male or female sterilization to prevent pregnancy. And here I'll show you the data for all users, married and unmarried, in 1982 and again in 1988. A contemporary writing in family planning perspectives observed, quote, "The pill has fallen from its pedestal to take its place among other contraceptives, each with flaws and assets," unquote. Adverse health effects and the ensuing negative publicity toppled the pill from its vaunted status as a wonder drug. However, despite its decline in popularity and market share, it still remained the most popular temporary contraceptive among American women through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. In spite of the tumult over its safety, the pill had become so thoroughly incorporated into the fabric of American life after a few decades that it was no longer perceived as revolutionary in either a therapeutic or a social sense. By 1990, 80% of all American women born after 1945 had used the pill at some point in their lives. Part of the reason for the pill's enduring popularity was its lack of major competitors in the birth control marketplace. After the advent of the pill in 1960 and IUDs a few years later, it took almost 3 decades for the next wave of contraceptive innovation to come to market in the United States. Research and development on the Norplant implant and the Depo-Provera shot began in the United States in the 1960s, but they did not receive regulatory approval until the early 1990s. These methods and the ones that followed, such as the skin patch and the vaginal ring, were not radically inventive. They simply provided different delivery systems for synthetic hormones, the ones used in birth control pills, to enter the bloodstream. The pill remained the standard on whose technology newer methods were based and by which these were judged by contraceptive users. With the long delay in getting new methods to market, and with the relatively low level of innovation of those methods, there was a growing sense among birth control researchers, policymakers, and providers that the contraceptive revolution begun by the pill had ended. A 1988 article in Family Planning Perspective asked, "Whatever happened to the contraceptive revolution?" And a series of meetings held by the National Academy of Science resulted in a 1990 book called Developing New Contraceptives, Obstacles and Opportunities, which focused more on obstacles than on opportunities. In 1995, the editor of Family Planning Perspectives, Michael Klitsch, summarized the stasis in contraceptive research in an article he titled "Still Waiting for the Contraceptive Revolution." Klitsch reviewed the factors that others had identified as contributing to the death of the revolution. First, he noted the chilling effect of product liability costs resulting from both individual and class action lawsuits against contraceptive manufacturers. Second, he pointed to the financial burden of increased government regulation of contraceptive products as the FDA required more and more stringent testing of experimental methods in animals and humans. Third, he enumerated several reasons for changes in public opinions about contraceptives. As I discussed earlier, the enthusiasm over the pill in the early 1960s had waned in the aftermath of the safety debate and intensified by the media coverage of the adverse health effects. Klitschko attributed greater public scrutiny of and skepticism toward contraceptives in the 1970s, and especially those pharmaceuticals and devices available by prescription only, to the growing influence of the consumer movement and the women's movement. The political dimension of American attitudes toward contraception was further complicated in the 1980s by the emergence of HIV and AIDS, against which only barrier methods offered any protection, and by the increasingly acrimonious abortion debate, which swept contraceptives into its maelstrom. Collectively, these factors thwarted enthusiasm for exploring novel approaches to preventing pregnancy. And finally, Klitsch reported that the pharmaceutical industry saw limited opportunities for growth and profits in the contraceptive sector of developed countries because the market was already saturated with existing products. Companies feared that new contraceptives would not attract enough new users to be profitable, or they might eat into the profits of their already existing products on the market. The safer bet was to stick with current product lines. Thus, the solution for drug companies already in the oral contraceptive business was simply to tinker with existing product formulations. In addition, more companies entered the pill market after 1984 when the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act, which is also known as the Hatch-Waxman Act, set up the modern system of generic drug approval and regulation, allowing generic versions of existing formulations to be marketed and sold. The total number of different birth control pills available increased dramatically, and by 2007, there were more than 90 brand name and generic oral contraceptive products in the market in the United States alone. Physicians, pharmacists, and women could choose pills based on price, since the action of these contraceptives, or their therapeutic equivalents, was basically the same. Brand name manufacturers had to find a way to make their products stand out from the generic crowd. One of the tactics used by manufacturers to promote their products was to rebrand oral contraceptives as drugs to remedy acne, to suppress monthly menstruation, or to treat a condition called PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. In 1992, Ortho McNeil petitioned the FDA for approval of orthotricycline for the treatment of acne. While physicians had been prescribing oral contraceptives off-label for acne treatment since the 1960s, orthotricycline was the first to seek and receive formal FDA approval for this indication. In 2003, Duramed, which is a subsidiary of Bar Pharmaceuticals, received FDA approval to market Seasonal as the first extended cycle oral contraceptive, which reduced the number of bleeding periods from 12 to 4 per year. As in the case of acne, the knowledge that taking oral contraceptives continually would eliminate monthly periods was not new. In fact, the first advertisement for Enovid in 1960 promoted it not for contraceptive purposes, but rather to postpone menstruation, as you can see from the copy, for convenience, for peace of mind, for full efficiency on critical occasions, unquote. What Bar did in 2003 was to formalize this indication. 3 years later, Bayer won approval to market its Yaz brand as a treatment for PMDD and for acne. And Bayer's birth control pill has been extraordinarily successful. In 2009, Yaz was the best-selling oral contraceptive on the American market. Moreover, it was the 21st best-selling drug among all prescription drugs in terms of the number of prescriptions filled, which was almost 10 million, and it ranked 50th overall in terms of its retail sales of about $700 million a year. These new uses for oral contraceptives, acne treatment, menstrual suppression, and PMDD therapy, and the aggressive marketing campaigns undertaken by their manufacturers suggest a shift in the pharmaceutical industry toward marketing birth control pills as lifestyle drugs. Now, variously defined as medications taken for cosmetic, enhancing, or recreational purposes, lifestyle drugs include products such as weight loss tablets, impotence therapies, and hair restorers. It would be inaccurate and anachronistic to describe the birth control pill as the first lifestyle drug, as some historians have suggested. Although the pill may have been the first prescription medication meant to be taken by healthy people, categorizing it first and foremost as a lifestyle drug diminishes its significance in meeting a critical and basic health need for both individuals and populations, namely the need for a reliable and effective method of preventing pregnancy. Indeed, oral contraceptives confer upon their users the significant health benefit of the avoidance of pregnancy that cannot simply be considered cosmetic, enhancing, recreational, or discretionary. However, the secondary effects for which some brands are promoted do fit the lifestyle characterization. Acne, monthly bleeding, and periodic moodiness are common conditions that constitute inconvenience, unpleasantness, and varying degrees of suffering, but they are rarely life-threatening or wholly debilitating. Moreover, the newer brands of birth control pills are not being marketed solely for the primary indication of family planning. For example, ads for Seasonal and its more recent iteration, which is Seasonique, promote freedom from menstruation, not freedom from pregnancy. Yaz's slogan, Beyond Birth Control, implies that its real purpose is to deal with the miseries attendant upon menstruation, such as headaches, irritability, and pimples. Pharmaceutical manufacturers are not selling contraception per se as a lifestyle option. Rather, they pitch menstruation or acne or moodiness as an annoying condition to be ameliorated by their products. The emphasis on secondary effects instead of on the primary indication in advertisements represents an attempt to differentiate products in a crowded field, since no one brand can claim superior efficacy in the prevention of pregnancy. When the contraceptive aspect takes a back seat, the pill appears as a lifestyle drug in its marketing materials. And thus, over time, the pills transitioned from a radically innovative drug that upended therapeutic and social conventions to a time-honored member of the pharmacopoeia, considered so basic that it's now marketed for its secondary effects. This transition in the pill's social status offers an interesting perspective for delineating the contours of this particular therapeutic revolution. The pill was once one of the numerous so-called wonder drugs that traveled from scientific laboratories via pharmaceutical companies into physicians' armamentaria in the mid-20th century. And the initial slope of the pill's revolutionary gradient was steep. Within its first decade, the pill had revolutionized more in the world of medicine than simply the therapeutics of birth control. In the early 1960s, it expanded the therapeutic purview of physicians to incorporate the writing of prescriptions for healthy women of reproductive age. It also gave women greater agency in demanding the treatment they wanted to prevent pregnancy. At the end of the 1960s, the debate over the safety of the pill appeared to threaten the very foundations of medical practice by calling into question status quo relationships among patients, doctors, drug manufacturers, and government regulators. It gave a voice to feminist health activists and a platform for them to expound their critique of paternalistic medicine and their vision for a more patient-centered healthcare. And this therapeutic revolution extended beyond medicine to contribute to social and cultural changes associated with sexual liberalization and second-wave feminism. Of course, the pill did not introduce the notion of birth control, and women have adopted technologies to control their fertility for millennia. And again, I would encourage you to go upstairs and see just the wonderful collection of pre-pill methods available. White women in the United States reduced the national fertility rate from 7 children per woman in 1800 to 3.5 in 1900 using condoms, pessaries, douching, withdrawal, and abstinence as methods. What the pill introduced in the second half of the 20th century was a new cultural norm in which women could expect to plan and schedule childbearing. The pill could effect such a sweeping shift because it differed from pre-existing methods in its near-perfect effectiveness and thus its greater reliability. This new cultural norm was part of a broader revolution in the roles and status of women in society that took shape after 1960. The biological responsibility of childbearing was not the only impediment to women's liberation. Long-standing social mores, cultural habits, laws, and economic arrangements also contributed to the fettering of women. American women had begun to address these inequities as early as 1848 at the very first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. But so long as biology was seen as destiny, women struggled to gain full equality with men. The pace at which laws, policies, and conventions were successfully challenged and overturned in the 1960s and 1970s was accelerated by women's control over their fertility. Wrote one observer in 1982, quote, "Without the advent of the pill and women's response to the freedom it promised, our present age would clearly be very different, and so would our vision of the future," unquote. As the historian Elaine Tyler May neatly summarized in 2010, quote, "Today, women no longer need to choose between having a family and a career. At the pill's 50th anniversary, that alone is worth celebrating." Just as contemporaries recognized the immediate and potential revolutionary impact of the pill in the 1960s, reflections on the occasion of the pill's semi-centennial also acknowledged its historic transformative effects. But it was clear to those taking retrospective stock that the revolution had run its course. From the vantage point of 2010, the pill had unleashed great changes in contraception and in women's lives compared to 50 years earlier, but the pace of change had slowed or stalled as the decades progressed. The success of the pill did not lead to further truly innovative contraceptive development, and concerns over its safety tempered initial enthusiasm about the method. By the 1970s, the pill was no longer lauded as a revolutionary therapeutic. Instead, it had settled into the workaday toolbox of modern medicine, alongside antibiotics, cortisone, and other mid-century wonder drugs as a useful but somewhat flawed pharmaceutical product. The decline in contraceptive research and development contributed, perhaps somewhat ironically, to the enduring popularity of the pill both in the United States and worldwide because of the dearth of desirable alternatives. In addition, manufacturers developed oral contraceptive formulations in the 1970s and 1980s with smaller amounts of synthetic hormones and diminished side effects. Concerns about increased risk of breast cancer were mitigated by research that demonstrated the pill's protective effect against ovarian cancer. With hundreds of millions of women years of experience by the end of the 20th century, scientific, medical, and popular opinion cohered into consensus that the pill was benign and beneficial. While no longer a revolutionary force, the pill rebounded from its nadir in the 1970s to its abiding position as a reliable contraceptive workhorse. As a revolutionary innovation in the 1960s, the pill brought birth control into the public eye as no method had done before. The lasting effect of that shift, in historian James Reed's words, "From private vice to public virtue," is that today, more than 99% of American women between the ages of 15 and 44 who have ever had sexual intercourse have tried at least one contraceptive method. Of those women, 82% used the pill. The pill continues to have major, if not revolutionary, influence worldwide. In 2009, the pill, as compared to all other contraceptives, had the widest geographic distribution around the world and the greatest proportion of countries in which at least 30% of contraceptive users chose it as a method of birth control. Overall, more than 100 million women relied on the pill as their primary method of birth control. The pill also helped to normalize daily pharmaceutical consumption. For women in most countries in North America, Western Europe, and Oceania, oral contraceptives are still only available by prescription, but this restriction is not the case in other parts of the world. Of 147 countries surveyed in 2012, almost 70% allowed the pill to be obtained without the explicit permission of a doctor. With or without a physician's prescription, most oral contraceptives are taken for the purpose of preventing pregnancy, although, as we have seen, secondary indications to prevent menstruation, acne, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder may account for some proportion of that total. In that simple act of swallowing a tablet each morning or before going to bed, 100 million individuals participate in the interwoven histories of birth control, women's liberation, and pharmaceutical consumerism that represent the legacy of the pill's therapeutic revolution. Thank you. Yes?
A few slides back on your chart of the fertility rates of American women over the last 200 years, I noticed that there was a fertility spike actually right around the invention of the pill. Do you know the reason for that?
That's called the baby boom. Yes, that's really perceptive of you, but that's exactly right. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, the baby boom, what you're seeing there, and you know, it's kind of hard to tell, but that spike starts in the 1950s, and it starts, as you know, the baby boom is from 1946 to 1964. And so perhaps the beginning of that decline is also coincidentally is tied to the advent of the pill and its great availability in the early 60s. That's a good observation. I see one in the back.
What are the chances in the U.S., do you think, that the pill will be available over the counter in the future?
I hear that those conversations are happening right now. It's interesting that you asked that question. When I was working on this, actually back in the 90s, in 1994, there were FDA hearings about bringing the pill to market as an over-the-counter prescription. And at the time, feminist health activists were opposed to it because they were concerned that for many women, their only access into healthcare was via their prescription for birth control, and that without going to a physician or to Planned Parenthood or to a clinic to get the prescription, that they wouldn't be getting their normal exam. They wouldn't have pap smears, and they wouldn't have a physical examination. Now, fast forward to 20 years, and we're in a different place now, where, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, healthcare is much more accessible, and so there are discussions again about making the pill over the counter. The interesting concern is over price. So that birth control pills, as you know, the Affordable Care Act has declared that for that prescription birth control be made free. And certainly in the years prior to the ACA, if it was by prescription, it was available for reduced fees. If you had health insurance, it was obviously much lower cost, and Planned Parenthood could offer it for much lower cost. So the concern was that often when drugs go off prescription, they are charged a much higher market rate. And we saw this with, I think, Claritin is a good example of that, an allergy medicine. So the concern was that they would become too expensive. So those are the discussions underway. Will the ACA cover birth control if it's available over the counter? And I think if that's the case, I think we are headed in that direction because, as I mentioned, the literally hundreds of millions of women years of use, combined with the fact that we see that 70% of other countries allow women to get the pill without a prescription, seems to offer sufficient evidence that women have the ability to take this without significant health problems. It's a good question. Thank you.
I'm just curious, you didn't emphasize too much the role of AIDS and the use of condoms to prevent AIDS in the rise of the lifestyle advertising, right, of the pill, but it would seem possibly logical that they would be connected. That is, if you're starting, if you're turning back to condoms in order to prevent AIDS, but they also prevent pregnancy, right, then, you maybe don't need the pill, right, for its original purpose, right, quite as firmly as you might have before, right, and so then, would you then turn to it? Is the advertising affected by that, or was that not so much a piece of it?
That's a great observation, and I never saw anything that explicitly linked the two. And so that's why I'm hesitant to sort of connect them. And I think there are a number of factors to this. And as you know, the United States was not very forthcoming in advertising the use of condoms for AIDS in the 80s. So we don't really start talking about condoms until the late 80s. And even then, we're talking about it largely in the context of homosexual sex. So it's very delayed. And by that time, the pill was on its sort of upward trajectory again, that it had sort of rebounded from the nadir. So I think the advertising went to different populations. I think, your point is a large one, not just about AIDS, but condoms for any kind of sexually transmitted disease. And, I don't have enough data on this because I think that statistics are collected differently about whether people are using condoms purely for contraception versus whether they're using them also for the prevention of sexually transmitted diseases. And I don't think that, the main source of statistics is the Alan Guttmacher Institute. And I think when they ask about, they may not be taking into account with the condoms doing double duty. So I don't have enough data to say. I think there's probably some piece of that, but there's this, whether it's historical or whether it's just pragmatic, women's reliance on the pill just because I think of its greater effectiveness. And I think what you probably find is particularly younger women using both for the two different purposes. Yeah?
So
Tim?
one question, well, we talked earlier about the difficulty of doing research on a topic like this because companies are not forthcoming with divulging their strategies. But I wondered, in terms of the agency of this off-brand use, have you ever had discussion that brings together physicians, marketing people, and business people to figure out who's pushing it most strongly?
That's a great question, and I have not. In answer to, Jim and I have talked about this numerous times about the reluctance of proprietary companies to share their marketing materials or their marketing strategies. And I was sharing a story earlier today about when I very first started this project, and I was really excited because I had found that Searle, which was the company that was the first manufacturer of Innovid, had a company newsletter for its salesmen called the Searle Man. And I had seen a copy of this because it had been deposited as testimony in the Senate hearings. And I thought, well, if there's one, there's got to be several more. And wouldn't this be really interesting to track how the company perceived the marketing of the pill, particularly in 1960 when it was very controversial. I did find some documents that said that Searle fully expected they might lose 25% of their business because Roman Catholics in America might boycott not just Innovid, but all of their products. And so I thought that I would find this, and so I talked to people at Searle, and I thought I could get access, and they said, oh, yes, we have them in our archives, and we'd love to share them with you. And then the person who was very helpful I was talking to said these fateful words, let me just run this by the lawyers. And that was the last I ever saw them. I never got to see them. They said, no, we can't share this with you. So, fast forward now to, 20 years later, when I'm thinking about this, when I'm researching the lifestyle, or this notion of a pill as a lifestyle drug and it being advertised. And yes, I wrote a couple of letters. Of course, now the letters are emails and no response. So it's sort of been radio silence. And so for historians like myself who are interested in getting at these, we often find that we have to use other sources. So the advertising materials are very useful to us. And then things like Senate hearings and lawsuits are very helpful because materials have to be deposited. So you can get, and once they become part of the public record, then we can use them. But no, we have not had a lot of conversation with manufacturers, though I would love to see that.